So thank everyone for being here today. I know I've been receiving text messages, everybody like, traffic's bad, weather's bad, did you actually get started at 8:30? Can I come at 9? Wait a minute. So I appreciate everyone being here. And I know, especially this time of year, end of year, it tends to be busy for everyone. And I really, very sincerely, just appreciate the investment of your time. I know how important and valuable that is. To those of you who may not know me, I'm Cory Simpson. I'm the ICIT CEO, and I'm also the co-chair of the ICIT Task Force on Digital Consolidation. The report, which we're launching today, is currently live on our website. So I want to talk to you a little bit about that report. But before we do that, it's important to have a little bit of context and a little bit of tone. One, for context, we have a dialogue on digital consolidation, and it's a hard topic. We brought together some of the smartest people that we know in industry, leaders throughout, government experience, policymakers, to really take a short run and get a report ready for the incoming administration in Congress. And we'll talk a little bit about why we did that. But the tone of the report, I think it's important to note just right up front, while we're looking at digital consolidation and the societal risks that it causes, day to day, it's a good thing. We get economies of scale, we get efficiencies, we get better technology integration, and this has brought tremendous value to society. At the same time, and throughout human history, we've seen when we consolidate, we create societal risk. And while the internet's about 50 years old, we have about 5,000 years of human history that is filled with examples of what can happen when we put too many things in one particular place. And that's what the report is about. So let me tell you a little bit about the who. So ICIT, for those of you who don't know, is the Institute for Critical Infrastructure Technology. We're a nonprofit, nonpartisan, 501c3, whose mission is modernizing, securing, and making resilient critical infrastructure that provides for people's foundational needs. ICIT takes no institutional positions on policy matters, but we rather than advocate, ICIT is dedicated to being a resource for the organizations and communities that share in our mission. Our strategic partner for this endeavor was the Cyber Risk Alliance, CRA, and CRA provides business intelligence that helps the cybersecurity ecosystem connect, share information, accelerate careers, and make smarter, faster decisions. Through its trusted information, brands, network of experts, and innovative events, it provides cybersecurity professionals with actionable insights and acts as a powerful extension of the cybersecurity marketing teams. The task force, 6 members, co-chaired by myself and Brett Freedman, and it includes leaders from the cybersecurity, business, and industry, 3 of whom you'll hear from later this morning. So the how. How did all this come together? How do we work together? ICIT supported the effort, writing, convening, and opening up our network of security and business leaders nationwide. We brought in our strategic partner to the table, CRA, and CRA supported the effort by first conducting an industry survey of over 300 IT professionals, cybersecurity practitioners, and business executives. The survey captured consolidation trends, benefits, challenges, drawbacks, and strategic considerations. CRA helped us edit the report and professionally produce our final product. Thank you to CRA. The task force led the effort, strategically guiding the research and focus and masterfully refining issues, framing, and recommendations. We also benefited from the support of Indiana University's, Bloomington's top and upcoming cyber leader and lawyer, Tanner Wilburn. Tanner, thank you. We also benefited from a comprehensive red team review by some of the world's greatest cybersecurity and policy leaders. The win. We did all of this in 120 days. That's a pretty quick timeline for anyone that's led an effort like this. Run anything through an interagency process or just a department or agency process. We did it quickly on an issue that we labeled entrenched and multifaceted. We knew the next administration and Congress needed the homework done when they took office, so it was imperative that we release this report prior to the administration and Congress taking office. This brings us naturally to the why. So why did we do all this? Take on this effort in such a condensed timeline to get ready to get homework done for the next administration and Congress. Well, in April of 2024, so April of this year, the Cyber Safety Review Board report was released, and among other things, it highlighted the critical role of cloud computing to the nation and much of the world. Then in July of 2024, CrowdStrike outage. It was triggered by a faulty software update and was addressed within about an hour and a half. It negatively impacted about 1% of Windows devices worldwide, approximately 8.5 million devices. It's estimated to have cost the Fortune 500 companies about $5.5 billion in damages. Imagine 10% of Windows machines go down for a day. Expanding those numbers from the CrowdStrike outage, that would be 85 million Windows devices down for about 12 times the period that it was down for the Microsoft or for the CrowdStrike outage, which was 1.5 hours. So you project that out to damages to Fortune 500 companies, that would be about 66 billion in damages for a day. I know the disclaimers, this time it would be unique, this would be different, it's apples to oranges, salamanders, porcupines, however you want to do it. And I know the example before us is CrowdStrike and Microsoft, but that's not the point, and it doesn't have to be. It could be a handful or two of predominantly US companies in which our digital world's core functions and features are consolidated. Those building it, from the telcos and CSPs to those defending it, large cybersecurity companies, all are very easily recognizable. The point is that digital consolidation is a societal risk that warrants the next administration and Congress's attention. So, our report, Building Resilience to the Societal Risk in a Digitally Consolidated World. Our theory is that resilience to societal risk posed by digital consolidation can be had, and it can quickly be had. Cyberspace has rapidly evolved from a sci-fi idea to a place that we went for entertainment and communication, to a domain for business and even warfighting, to what it is today, a digital world as vital to our modern way of life as our physical world. We must start thinking about it in this way and prioritizing its security and its resilience accordingly. Our urgent and first priority must be to build resilience to the societal risk posed by digital consolidation. The theme in the report is 4 R's. 4 R's of digital resilience. Resourcing begins here. Market forces alone have failed to drive the investments needed to mitigate it. Societal risk created by digital consolidation. The U.S. government must, therefore, make targeted and modest investments to facilitate such resilience. Recovery. We must think differently and bigger about what it would take to recover from a digital disaster. We need to develop recovery plans like we do for the physical world. Once we've developed comprehensive plans for digital disaster, we need to rehearse those plans vigorously. Recovering will require unprecedented cooperation between governments and industry. We must rehearse these efforts outside of crisis. And finally, response. We need to eliminate the ambiguity in today's digital world. Bad actors, nation states, and others need to know the United States will respond to efforts, successful or otherwise, targeting and seeking to exploit our digital consolidation. This report is not a treatise on the broader sustainability questions of free markets, social contracts, although those discussions must be had. Rather, this report is a call to action for immediate and practical measures to mitigate the societal risk of digital consolidation and ensure the systems underpinning our lives and modern way of life are resilient. Thank you all for being involved. It took a team to get this report across the finish line and for us to be here today to discuss it. For the run of show today, we're going to have 2 sessions. The first will be a fireside chat led by Lieutenant General, United States Air Force retired, Mary O'Brien, with Brett Freedman and myself, the co-chairs of the task force. The second session will be a panel led by Parham F. Cory, one of our esteemed, and 3 of our esteemed task force members, Nick Anderson, Edna Conway, and Ankur Seeth. And then we'll have some closing remarks, and we'll call it a day. At this time, I'd like to invite Lieutenant General Mary O'Brien and Brett Freedman to the stage. While they're making their way up, I'll do a reading of their bio just so you have some context, some background. So General O'Brien is a former U.S. Air Force general officer and renowned leader in cybersecurity, emerging technology, and national security. With 34 years of distinguished service, she commanded at every level of the Air Force and served in pivotal cyber roles, including Director of Intelligence, U.S. Army Cyber Command, the Air Force's Deputy Chief of Staff for Intelligence, Surveillance, Reconnaissance, and Cyber Effect Operations. Mary is also a proud recipient of the Rear Admiral Grace Hopper Award, celebrating her innovative contributions to the fields of information and cyberspace. She is the principal of Mary O'Brien Strategies, LLC, a consulting business which provides clients with expert guidance to navigate complex digital challenges, focusing on risk mitigation, technology integration, and resilience-building strategies. She's a member of the Academy Securities Geopolitical Intelligence Group Advisory Board and actively contributes to cybersecurity policy and practice throughout her involvement with the Cyber Guild, where she champions initiatives for a sustainable cybersecurity ecosystem. Her leadership extends to the Cyber Guild's prior events, Critical Infrastructure in the Digital Age, Mind the Gaps, which address public-private collaboration challenges in securing vital systems, and the Future of National Cybersecurity, which brought together key leaders from the U.S. Department of Defense invested in creating and delivering strategies for our nation's cyber defense. Her extensive experience and strategic acumen position her as a trusted voice in advancing resilience and security issues across critical infrastructure sectors. And Brett Freedman, the task force co-chair. Brett is the founder and president of Canopy Consulting Group, a strategic advisory firm, and served as the chief of staff for Assistant Attorney General Matt Olson of the National Security Division of the Department of Defense. Previously, Brett spent 7 years working for the Senate Select Committee on Intelligence as both minority counsel for Senator Dianne Feinstein and general counsel for Chairman Mark Warner. Previously, Mr. Freedman worked as an attorney in the executive branch roles in the National Counterterrorism Center of the Office of the National Director of Intelligence and at the National Security Agency's Group of Office of General Counsel. In 2013, Brett was elected to serve as the counsel to the President's Review Group on Intelligence and Communication Technologies that stood up following the unauthorized disclosure by Edward Snowden. It's hard for me to say that name.
Say his name.
Earlier in his career, Brett served as a Presidential Management Fellow for DHS in the Bureau of Customs and Border Protection, and as an advisor to former Secretary Ridge in the Office of International Affairs. Brett's career in public service began after college when he was hired as a legislative assistant for Congressman Michael E. Capuano. Brett, Mary, thank you for being here. I look forward to the conversation. Mary, I'll turn it over to you.
Great. Given my military background, I think going back to the beginning of your opening remarks about risk would be a great place to start. You said that the consolidation results in risk, but a skeptic, can you guys hear me? A skeptic, if you could get them to read the report, might argue that digital consolidation itself is not inherently risky. Rather, as you said, consolidation offers some benefits: efficiency, scalability, the ability to pool resources. So the skeptic might believe that these perspectives result in friction between efficiency and diversification, but not a threat. So explain to us how the task force in your analysis concluded that digital consolidation creates these vulnerabilities, and why skeptics, or really everyone and anyone, should care about the risks inherent in a digital monoculture where all the computers are using the same operating software.
Want to take that? So thanks, Mary, and welcome everyone. I think from it was not a easy or cut or dry, black or white question or problem to approach. There is, as Cory noted in his opening remarks, a whole set of very significant positive aspects that are unprecedented in many instances, including the material wealth that has been accumulated as a result of many of these technological innovations. And it's been wonderful that much of it, if not the significant part, has been domestically brought to the fore, albeit in an international marketplace. And I think taking that and understanding in a risk context, I think that we have deliberately, or just in a comfort sense, overlooked or not dealt with the underlying problems that ensue as a result of consolidation. It is true historically over thousands of years as it relates to the manner in which we as people constantly, whether it's geopolitically, business-wise, or otherwise, constantly, merge and move and progress. I think that there's an inherent set of risks that we try to point out in this report associated with that. And in particular, just having, it's tough to say a single point of failure, because in many instances you have a robust set of security if you're in a particular ecosystem provided by one of these companies, and they will point that out in the cloud systems that they propagate. And that's not, we're not denigrating or indicating in any way, shape, or form that's not a good thing. But I think from a geopolitical sense, from a national security perspective, it is inherently problematic for us to not take a look and really try and dedicate the resources and the time and effort to assure that risk, which is ever increasing as a result of certain providers being kind of the only game in town, if you will, to lead to problems if a nefarious actor, which we know have been propagating themselves, wanted to do something bad, they could do so and make it much easier for them to do so by having that one point of entry.
Yeah, thank you. As someone whose previous responsibilities included identifying vulnerabilities in our adversaries, I just want to clarify that I am not a skeptic about the conclusion of the report, that I agree with your conclusion about the risk of the consolidation. Do you want to add something?
Yeah, I would. I don't know. Everybody can hear me? Okay. Yeah. So the. Okay. All right. Thank you. So sort of from I'll take a perspective just from similar career, though nowhere near as successful. I've had 30 years working with the best law enforcement and military organizations the world has known, targeting organized crime and terrorist groups. One of the most prolifically used targeting models is Carver. How many show of hands, anybody heard of the Carver methodology? That's good. It's good. Most folks in the room. And so 6 factors: criticality, accessibility, recoverability, vulnerability, effect, recognizability. Apply a Carver analysis to our digital world. Consolidation makes very recognizable targets. Criticality. I think we saw pretty critical targets. Effect, the effect it has, we talked a little bit about that. These are very high value targets. And in a world that is increasingly dangerous with volatile geopolitical risk everywhere, it's imperative that we address a specific form of risk that we're talking about here, societal risk. So it's not the day-to-day, the ransomware, the recommendations. The audience for the report that we created is the President of the United States and Congress. So it's the type of risk that rises to that level that they should address. And so I believe when you sit back and you look at this and you're like, where would America's vulnerabilities be? You take that targeting methodology, you look at it, and you're like, that makes some pretty good targets. And then remember the realities of our physical world. Still separated by 2 oceans, have friends to our north and south. And there's a competing model to our version of the internet that China has brought to the table. And it's one that they invested in by laying 70,000 miles of undersea cables last year. And it's also one in which they're pulling more and more countries in through their digital Silk Road strategy. So this is something we should think about, especially as tensions globally rise. How can the U.S. government offset that vulnerability or those risks? And that's what this report is about, and that's kind of how I see it.
Yeah, thank you. The report was perhaps a result of a high-profile incident like the CrowdStrike software patch that led to the problems with Microsoft operating system. Not all of those types of events become as high profile. And so how do you address criticism that was an unfortunate, isolated incident and not really an ominous sign of our future if this digital consolidation trend continues? How do we highlight the real risks of the over-reliance on a relatively small and decreasing number of providers?
So I think it's very true as it relates to the kind of single incident, and not extrapolating that to necessarily be characterizing the overall environment. I think from the vantage point of particularly CrowdStrike, that presented itself with an opportunity. It was self-inflicted. It wasn't nefarious. It showcased a mistake in coding that led to, as Cory noted, approximately $5 billion in economic impact. I think that is an opportunity that we as a country ought to really pay attention to and try and do our best to ameliorate, not eliminate. The risk is not going to be diffuse. It's not going to be exterminated. This is something that is going to be something that we need to live with and deal with. And I think that we are fortunate in that there have been incidents that have been widely felt, that have been non-nefarious in nature, but at the same time, I think that it is very much a characterization of the environment today, that there is a greater number of daily intrusions, of daily exfiltration of information, of daily attempts that oftentimes go either under the radar aren't necessarily successful, kind of our attempts to knock on the door, but have impacts themselves. And with many of because of the privately owned infrastructure, right, that you have oftentimes publicly traded companies, you're having a really interesting push and pull, particularly subsequent to the SEC rule of reporting last year, that kind of where does the line drawn, and when are we going to go out front and say it? And I think I would go out front and say that I think there's a lot more that has been happening than is widely known, and these are instances that we should highlight and ensure that we're appropriately structured.
I think the only thing that I would add is that as we think through this, one, again, 5,000 years of human history, the internet 50 years old. We're still learning what consolidation in the digital world, what that means. We've seen examples from the fall of the Roman Empire, just the last half of that 5,000 years, fall of the Roman Empire, the Black Plague, most recently COVID. Consolidation creates risks in unforeseen ways that apply to at a societal level, and it's important that governments look to address those risks. And I think in this context, I think one of the most important things that we can start to realize is that paradox, and it's not a paradox to be fought, but just a reality to be embraced, is look, the things that bring us so much benefit in our day-to-day lives, the economies of scale, the simplicities in our system, the enhanced security for our small businesses across and around the globe. Those same things, when you put them all into one place, can create risk. And that's not something that's going to go away. It's something that we should just face, talk about, and explore ways to mitigate that.
Yeah, let me change gears a little bit because we're not alone in our use of the digital environment, digital tools. So you implicitly mentioned China, that there are other models of a digital ecosystem environment. And so China's created a controlled and state-monitored internet, which is a very different alternative than what we're using in the West. How does this splinter net model favored by authoritarian governments compare from a threat perspective to our and our allies' use of our digital infrastructure?
Well, I think that it is, the splinter net is not hypothetical. I think that it is very much being realized today, and increasingly so. I think that from the perspective of the United States, I think that it's not necessarily, the democracy versus communism. This is something that is much more from a systematic perspective, from looking at this as a closed system versus an open system. By virtue of that, there are an inherent limitless number of vectors upon which adversaries can get at our system. It is not government owned. Our companies are separate from the government. And so as a result, there are complications inherent to our system that we simply need to be cognizant of and do our best to ensure, and this is where many of the recommendations touch upon, particularly public-private partnerships. I think that the corporate and the government side of things, there's different cultures associated with that, but because approximately, over 3/4 at least of the infrastructure is owned and operated by private entities, we need to come to grips with, well, what happens if, something, not necessarily, you don't want to say goes boom, it's not necessarily that. I think that we've had instances that are replete over the last decade, but have not necessarily risen to the point where we have had a come to the fore moment of a societal, okay, now there's something to be done. In contrast, I just think that it's tough to not look at in the physical space what transpired in 9/11 and the tragedy of 9/11. You'd never expected businesses, skyscrapers to be able to be compelled to have air defense, right? When that did take place, it was a tragedy. It was unprecedented loss of life. But there wasn't a question from society of, okay, is there going to be a response and who's going to do it? It was a question of where are we going to go, when are we going to do it? And the resources wasn't a question either. It was all hands on deck. I think that if a similar or something of that magnitude were to transpire in the critical infrastructure space, we are woefully unprepared. And I think all indicators are that we're not going to be subject to most likely a kinetic instance of geopolitical encroachment. What we're going to be having is kind of an under the a nefarious actor getting in and under and realizing that, whoa, we can't operate the systems that we need to in order to be able to get the assistance to allies or otherwise that would essentially be able to counter such an instance.
Yeah. Cory, can I ask you to build on that concept of response? So I was in the Pentagon on 9/11, and so unlike the traditional military domains, air, land, water, and space, there aren't clear lines of responsibility for defense. When I was at Cyber Command in the early days, we were having all kinds of discussions about who we were responsible for protecting and responding to different events. And geography was not a good framework for us to build the response framework around. So what kind of paradigm shift are we looking for where we could establish accountability for responding to attacks on private sector digital critical infrastructure?
It's a fantastic question, and I think one to just it's hard for me, but I'm going to do it. I'm going to take off the lawyer hat, but just before I do that, throw out a reference that I don't know, it took us 2,000, 3,000 years to develop a law of war. We're 50 years into the internet. So like we've got some growing to do to understand how we target, how we make impact in that space, what nations are willing to accept and what they're not. And that is the need to develop that space and our understanding of it is happening very, very rapidly. And I'll tell you, just 4 or 5, it was 5 years ago now, the Cyberspace Solarium Commission. And we had a very difficult time drawing red lines. Red lines can be a very hard thing because once you draw them, you got to enforce them. And so when you talk about red lines in cyberspace, I believe it would have been 5 years ago almost unimaginable to get a room, even this size, of folks together and come to a consensus on what should be a red line. This report takes a step and says we should make red lines that entities and actors targeting digital consolidation in the West, that will be responded to by the U.S. government. That's important. I think it's wildly important for the impacts that carries throughout society. We've talked about just a few of those impacts, the cascading in nature, the unpredictable nature of those, and how today so much of our critical goods and services rely on digital connectivity. So if we're going to make that red line, if we're going to draw that, that's a very big step. And I think it's also important to point out just some of the complexity with doing that. I would hope that we can all agree, yeah, that makes sense that if a U.S. government said that they should respond to an actor targeting a consolidator. And you're like, I could also see it from the perspective of a small or medium-sized business that says you're further ingraining the hyperscalers or the bigger companies to control the environment. It's a balance. This is a hard conversation. And it's one that we felt important to have and have now because it demands urgent action. And so I would just say I do think that bit, it is very important for us in the day times that we live for the United States, our government, to make very clear things that are just off limit. We have to do that. We can wait for the international community to catch up, but our government should be able to say these things we're not okay with people targeting it, with bad actors targeting it.
Let's say we do establish red lines and an adversary crosses them, or even let's say they come up to the red line but they don't go across. In either case, we want our systems to be resilient. In my last job as the Joint Staff CIO, one of the things we spent a lot of time talking about is the need to be interoperable with our partners and allies when we work together. And so one of the things that contributes to resiliency is interoperability. But I would say we've seen market forces prioritizing proprietary or exclusive solutions. In order to improve resiliency up and across red lines, what measures or policies could encourage companies to adopt interoperable solutions?
Can I take a swag at this?
Yeah.
So I think on interoperability is just imperative in this. It has to happen. It's our first recommendation and our first pillar. Mandate interoperability and fund it. Market factors haven't encouraged the development of the degree of interoperability between big actors that we just require. Also, there are commercial practices, licensing agreements that lock people in to certain arrangements. Whether it's technical feasibility or contractual allowability, we have to allow redundancy in systems. I mean, it's that simple. I mean, anytime it's just sound judgment. When you're building a system, you don't build systems with single points of failure. Anybody with a military background in this room has heard of PACE plan, primary, alternate, contingency, emergency. You have to have failover systems, and then failover systems to those systems, especially for things that are important. There is much of our digital lives, our day-to-day lives, that are absolutely vital, and we have to have redundancy for the system supporting those. So our first recommendation, demand interoperability, fund it. And then we have a supporting recommendation that I think is important to talk about in this, with steps that can bring about this change, and that's in U.S. government procurement practices. I think the government can drive change in this in a very positive way by mandating interoperable systems within its own infrastructure. I think not only is that, again, just sound planning, it's something that could create trickle-down effects or outward effects for the larger economy. And I'll just say, to the challenge of this, how hard it is to be interoperable. Afghanistan, right? When it first, let's not talk about the withdrawal, but the first part of that, when we went over there, right? We got there, we had a very broad coalition of actors, almost exclusively U.S. air support. It was very difficult to communicate with ground forces. And they said, we're never going to be able to have interoperable systems. Well, NATO demanded it. A year later, we had interoperable systems. It can be done. I'm confident it can be done. We just have to have the will to do it.
Yeah, the only thing I would add to that is just simply, it does no good to a company when their systems are impacted and they get the disastrous blue screen, and all of a sudden the backup system is the same operating system. And so it's a direct trying to just showcase, but both from a legislative vantage point, you have to put the resources in because it's expensive to be able to implement this, and we recognize that. And at the same time, the procurement piece of it, from soup to nuts, you need to have interoperability built throughout.
So, Cory, you said you had the next administration in mind as you were both co-leading the task force. So let's look ahead to the next administration. Given, as we've already talked about, the private sector's dominance in owning our critical infrastructure, if you were to be an advisor in the next administration or an implementer, how could the U.S. government incentivize the private companies to align with our national cybersecurity goals and enhance this resiliency? You know, how can we build that trust? Again, there's frequently friction between the private companies who want less oversight and regulation and different administrations who want to regulate and provide guidance. So that friction. How can we foster collaboration to strengthen our digital ecosystem when we know that industry, particularly the larger influential industries, have a tendency to push back at this additional regulation?
It's a great question, and I think one, I wouldn't jump immediately to regulation. I don't know that we need to do that. I think the lightest touch of regulation may be necessary, but I think you would begin with where you begin with building a relationship. You need to talk to people. We need to have a conversation on this, and it needs to be a big table, and it needs to be broadly filled with a lot of different voices. I think anybody that has worked in the cyberspace policy area understands, it's a team sport, the ultimate team sport, right? What does that mean for dealing with a risk like this? And it means, we need to first understand that everybody does have different equities sitting at a table, and that's okay. It's okay to sit down with maybe even competitors in a marketplace, a government that's maybe a little, I believe, motivated differently than the private sector. And then even within, and we talk about the government and the private sector as if they're monolithic. They are not. They're vastly different just within those different pieces. And to solve this problem, and to do it in a way that we're building it at the speed and the scale that it needs to occur, I think it starts with a conversation. And these are hard things to talk about because it is impacting big pieces of economies. It's impacting big players in those ecosystems, and it's hard. But we have to have the courage to be able to do that. I'm very proud that ICIT had sponsored this initiative to be able to have this conversation. And I think as much as it takes courage, it takes patience, it takes understanding to be able to sit down across from a table with somebody that may be viewing the problem or the challenge very differently from you, and to be able to just say, hey, how can we find middle ground to preserve this nation of ours? Because the reality is, we throw the numbers out, right? 85%, whatever, the overwhelming majority of critical infrastructure belongs to the private sector. When you think of the digital world, it's all in the private sector. If you think about it, it's as much a good or a service as it is a digital world. If you have the internet, you're paying for it. And so that makes it a marketplace. And in the United States, markets have long time gravitated towards consolidation. It's well documented. We understand this. How do we just check those things and make sure that we're addressing this massive risk that currently exists in the ecosystem? Sorry.
All right. And also thinking ahead to the next administration and the policies of our engagement in this area with potential adversaries or competitors, how would you propose that the U.S. send a clear message that attacks on our U.S. digital critical infrastructure would be met with decisive responses but you would want to avoid escalating the conflict, into the physical space. Previously, when I was on active duty, we would talk about sending a message to China, and we're going to fly a bomber on a path in around the ocean. And the current chairman, General Brown, when he was Chief of Staff of the Air Force and my boss, would say, how do we know that message was clearly communicated and that the message we intended to send was the message that was received? And so let's talk about how we would, if and when there's red lines or some kind of equivalent communication on parts of our digital infrastructure that are critical and off limits, how are we going to do that messaging?
Let me start, but I will not take in any way, shape, or form represent a military background from my end of things, much more in the political space. And I think from my vantage point, I think that ambiguity is very difficult, especially if you were to look at this as being the way in which the message is conveyed being on the digital world is not easily or clearly understood. And so you have the shaping and signaling, as Ben Buchanan has written upon extensively, in diplomacy and geopolitics, there's very easily miscalculation, misinterpretation, and all of a sudden you're off to the races on some particular belief of something that just simply was not the intent of the initial intrusion or the initial action undertaken. So I think it needs to be clearly articulated. It needs to be done in a very high-profile manner, accompanied by most likely, like a doctrine, a written product, whether that's in the context of an executive order. I think it's in the administration's best interest to clearly articulate, convey as best as one can, because there's just too much misunderstanding in the context of today's busy world, and an ability to misinterpret or disinformation or misinformation on the digital world side of things that just simply you cannot have that ambiguity in the digital space in it. So it is of utmost importance.
I think I'll just say that I hope I may have penned this right. What most people in the room are thinking, like we should do it via tweet. So the ways that we communicate have changed, and I do think that it's important, one, to understand that's a relevant part of this conversation, and we need to understand that there are going to be policy things communicated across the social media space from this day forward, right? So we need to understand the implications of that, and we need to understand that, one, in our institutions and in our policymaking apparatus, right, to the formal deterrence messaging, right? Like, how do you receive clarity to governments of what is tolerated, what is not, and what a response may look like? We should never, I believe we should never articulate like we will respond with military action. We should leave it open to the full apparatus of the military, of the U.S. government's capabilities, DIME, right, diplomatic, informational, military, economic. You could add the FIL to it, financial, intelligence, law enforcement, whatever the case. We have a broad swath of options that we can respond with. I think we can be ambiguous in what a response may look like, but I don't think we can be ambiguous in the clarity of the message of what we will respond to. And I think the world has seen in the CrowdStrike instance what can happen to disrupt the United States and the West. And I think we need to be preparing for that. And I think the U.S. government needs to communicate to actors that are thinking of exploiting that they won't tolerate it.
I hear in the tone of both your voices an implied sense of urgency, but could you make your perspective on how much time do we have, or where should this be in the priority of the next administration for this, looking at the recommendations you have and the analysis in the report? Where would digital consolidation of our critical infrastructure fit into the priorities of the next administration if you were advising them?
So I think, we go to great lengths to elucidate in the report itself. We're not saying that there's been a dearth of action or government-related policymaking and the creation of institutions that look at and deal with cyberspace, right? It is broad, it is diverse, and that ecosystem has built, and we should not do away. We shouldn't, act counter to. We should build upon that. I think that from my vantage point, and I won't speak for Cory here, but I think very clearly, it is an urgent issue. It's an urgent issue in the sense, I don't think the public would necessarily tolerate if something were to happen of a magnitude that it's not just Delta Airlines going down for 4 days and being an inconvenience. It's something that it impedes basic critical services on a daily basis for people. It is very quickly to ramp up. And what I fear is, and have seen in my experience, whether you're looking at 9/11, whether you're looking at the Snowden disclosures, there's a constant push and pull with policymakers of there's not a proactive nature, right? You don't get the bipartisan, particularly today, but you don't get the bipartisan push to get something over the finish line without that urgency. And I fear that in this instance, what we're trying to say is we are there. There needs to be a clear and consolidated focus and articulation of our policy in this space. And absent doing that, we're going to be putting the kitchen sink at it in a period of urgency. And I fear that I'd like to be more on the proactive side and trying to at least express or scream out, this is in need of direct attention from high-level officials.
As far as timelines, we wanted to empower this administration and this Congress to take action when they take their seats, when they come into office. There are a lot of folks putting out reports of saying, here's what the administration should look at. We also have a long history of, national securitization. Everything has become national security, right? So policy entrepreneurs throw a label of national security, my thing's national security, and then that gets, time, attention, resources. This issue is different. We're talking about a cascading effect to society. The risk we're talking about is societal risk. And it's when certain pieces of this digital world go down, it's almost impossible to predict what services, what cities, what towns, what governments are impacted, but we know it's going to be a lot. And I think that's the message that needs to come out, and that's the urgency behind this. We've been put on notice. The world has seen a vulnerability that is exposed in our digital landscape, and it's increasingly a volatile world. I think we should act with a sense of urgency for this specific risk that is at a societal level.
Great. Thank you both. Thank you for allowing me to join you. And there's more. So let me invite Param F. Cory to come up and bring the next panel. So thank you.